And again, we are so excited to be here today. A couple of items as you came in. Did everybody sign in? Did everybody sign in? No? Guy in the back didn't sign in. That's why he's sitting in the back. No, I'm just kidding. If you all don't start laughing, it's going to be a long 2 days, okay? All right? Let me tell you, we have some wonderful speakers that are going to talk about some very serious things. But at the end of the day, we know where our hope is, don't we? I said we know where our hope is, in Jesus Christ. And so, they can't laugh, but I can laugh a little bit, and you can laugh a little bit, because people laugh at me all the time anyway, so it's okay. All right. So if you haven't already, just take an opportunity to sign in. What that does is just let us know that you were here. Also, full disclosure, we'll probably be sending you one of our emails. We send out an email called A Moment of Prophecy. We send those out twice a week. They have words of encouragement from Dr. Spargimino, reminders of some pretty neat resources that we have coming, which we'll be talking about over the next 2 days as well. Also, if you didn't, make sure you pick up our prophecy calendar. Every year, Southwest Radio puts out a prophecy calendar, different themes every year, beautiful pictures of Israel. This year's prophecy calendar is based on James Collins' brand new book, The 12, which is an excellent book that he'll be talking about a little bit later on. But if you haven't already, we have these for you for free, our way of saying thank you for coming to the conference in person, okay? So make sure you pick up a copy for yourself. Maybe one for a neighbor, people that need calendars, stuff like that. Also, we have some free literature on the sign-in table as well. We have the last couple of issues of our Prophetic Observer newsletter. Each month, we put out the Prophetic Observer newsletter with very timely articles written by Dr. Larry Spargimino and James Collins. And we have a big announcement about the Prophetic Observer newsletter that we'll make here in just, not right now, but we'll make it a little bit later on today. But we've got some back issues of that I think you'll find interesting, such as James Collins' headline article from the June issue of last year, but we brought it because it was so popular, is the word rapture in the Bible. And he wrote an article about that, very interesting. But we've got a couple other issues, so check that out. That's absolutely free for you as well. As you noticed when you came in, you saw the resource tables back there with books and DVDs and T-shirts and mugs. I don't know how resourceful the mug is, I guess, unless you're drinking coffee, then it's pretty resourceful. But the books and DVDs are here for you. These are resources that truly do make an eternal impact, and we'll be talking about those throughout the conference. The main reason we're here, though, is to learn, to be encouraged, and hopefully to take what we learn out into our community, right? That's why we're here. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to open us up in a word of prayer. Talk a little bit about our schedule, and then welcome our first speaker. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity that you have given us to be here in Lakeland, Florida. We thank you for Cornerstone Baptist Church. We thank you for Pastor Larry. We thank you for the congregation and the staff here. We thank you for those that have traveled to learn and to be encouraged. We thank you for all those that are watching via the internet over today and tomorrow. Please bless these 2 days, bless the speakers and all the information that we're about to receive. We love you and we thank you so much for your saving grace. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, when you came in, you were able to get a schedule. If not, you can check it out on our website, SWRC.com. That's a great website. You should probably go there. You should probably like our Facebook page. Just saying. You should download our app, but we'll talk about that later too. A couple of schedule changes for you to know about. Of course, I coughed just as I'm about to tell you about people that got COVID, so that's great. I do not have COVID. But two of our speakers do. Greg Patton has COVID and is unable to be with us this weekend. And Dr. Kenneth Hill, my father, has come down with COVID, as well as my mother has, and so he's unable to be with us. And then Dr. Ken Lindow, our local friend here in Central Florida, emailed me yesterday, and he is under the weather, so he's unable to be here as well. But do not fret, do not fear, because we have adjusted our schedule accordingly. We've added a couple of brand new sessions we'll be telling you about, and so we've got all of that covered. But please be praying for Greg Patton and and for Dr. Kenneth Hill and for Dr. Lindow, please, as they are under the weather and not feeling well. I talked to Greg Patton and to Dr. Hill 2 days ago, and both of them, independent of each other, desperately wanted to be here. And one of them said, well, it was my dad. He said, your mom said I can go. And I said, well, could you remind me which medical school she went to? Because I forgot. And then I was admonished, as I should have been, and we went on from there. So, but please be praying for them. And they send their regrets, and they're sorry they couldn't be with you guys this weekend. So just make note of that. Now, on the schedule as well, you'll notice on tomorrow evening, it says at 6:15 p.m. there's going to be a Q&A session. That's actually going to be, I think, at 5 o'clock, if I understood the schedule correctly. What we're going to do is at the end of the first session, Edward is going to help me get a bowl or a box of some sort. We're going to put it right here on the stage. What we would ask you to do is, as you think of questions, which I know you will have because we've got some excellent topics to cover today and tomorrow, as you think of questions you would like to ask and that you would like to have answers to, just write them on a piece of paper. Could be a scrap of paper, doesn't matter, and just in between sessions come and put them in the box here. And then what we'll do is tomorrow at 5 o'clock, we're going to have a panel discussion with our speakers up here on the platform, and I'll moderate and we'll ask your questions, and our speakers will be answering those questions for you. So just an announcement about that as well. Also, Bill Federer is our first speaker today, and he's also our last speaker tonight because of Greg Patton not being here. And so what will happen tonight is, and just make this note change in your schedule, originally we had it on the schedule to break for dinner tonight at 5:30. What we're going to do, thank you. This is Edward, everybody, Edward Weber. Everybody say hi to Edward. I thought y'all were friendly. Come on, we can do better than that. There we go. This side didn't really do it, though, but that's okay. We love you. The Lord loves you, and please don't walk out. Okay, so this is where you put your questions. What we're going to do tonight, because of Mr. Patton unable to be with us, what we're going to do is we're not going to take a break for dinner. We're going to have Mr. Federer do the final session of the night, and we'll get out. That way everybody can leave just a little bit earlier. There's no reason to take a break and not have two sessions afterwards because we only have one now. Does everybody understand? So we just won't break for dinner, but Bill Federer will speak at 6 o'clock instead of 7. Make sense? So we're all good with our schedule, right? Okay. All right. So full disclosure as well, Bill Federer is currently, I think, doing an interview with Eric Metaxas in another room. So as soon as he is finished with that, he will be with us, and we'll begin with the first session, which is the true history of socialism. Now, this is a two-part presentation that Mr. Federer is going to be giving, but it is based on this book that he has authored, Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. Now, I know Mr. Federer pretty well. I've known him since I was about this tall and a lot skinnier, and he'll probably mention this book about 300 or 400 times, but I'm going to mention it first. It is in the back. This is an excellent resource, and you'll know why once he starts the presentation. But also you'll see his slides and his PowerPoint and everything up here on the screen. I'm really excited that he and his son have brought his presentation on a flash drive. So if you're feverishly taking notes, which I know a lot of folks like to do at the conferences, still take your notes if you want to, but just know that the flash drive is available with all of the notes, the citations, the references, everything on that flash drive as well, and that's available back at our resource table along with the True History of Socialism book as well. But I just wanted to let you know that because there's nothing worse than taking an hour's worth of notes and then go back and be like, oh, they were on the flash drive. Okay, well, I guess that helps where I missed part 3, so you'll have that as well. All right, so those are our announcements. Do we have an update on Mr. Federer? Okay, cool. Well, that's great. Well, while we wait on that, I also want to tell you about a couple of things that we have going on at Southwest Radio Ministries. We are super excited that we are now part of the American Family Radio Network. You can hear us on all of the AFR stations across the nation. We have also been added to the CSN radio network, which again is all over the United States, about 381 stations there, about 178 stations on AFR, plus the other stations. We've been on some of them for 30, 40 plus years. We've also launched our Watchman on the Wall podcast, so it can be on your schedule, and we encourage you to download the podcast. It's available every single day, and it's just the podcast of our daily radio program. We also have our SWRC app that you can download as well, and so we encourage you to do that also. One last thing to say in the way of announcements. It is so encouraging to know that there are folks wanting to get the kind of information you're going to hear today and tomorrow, the kind of information that we share not only here at our conference, at our in-person conference, but also we have our online virtual conference, our daily radio program, the books and DVDs and films that we produce as well. Speaking of our virtual conference, it's basically Prophecy Netflix is what it is. And what we do is it's basically a pay-per-view model. Our next virtual prophecy conference will be February 4th through the 12th. And we have 13 different speakers presenting, I think it's close to 25 or 26 different sessions. And of course, nobody wants to, well, maybe you all do. I'm sure somebody would like to sit through that, but that would take about 5 days to get through everything. So what we did was, it's all pre-recorded and it's put up on the internet, and what you do is you access it and watch it on your schedule, on demand, as many times as you want. We've even had folks do it with their Sunday school classes and things like that. It's called our Winter Virtual Prophecy Conference. Like I said, we've got 13 different speakers over 20 sessions, and you can register for that. Your church can register, family, whoever. Just go to our website, swrc.com, and then just click on events, swrc.com, and click on events, okay? All right, we are excited to welcome the host of American Minute. Go to his website, americanminute.com. He is an author, a conference speaker, an awesome person to interview on the radio or on television, and an all-around good guy that loves the Lord. I've known him since, well, for a really, really long time, and we love him, and we're so glad that he's here to help kick off this year's Central Florida Prophecy Conference. Please welcome Mr. Bill Federer.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you for taking the time to come. And I have a website called American Minute, and so americanminute.com, and I write a daily post, and it's something that happened on each date in American history. And so you can learn about all the different aspects of the country and the world from a different perspective. I tell people, history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. Past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. And so you put history together with prophecy, and you get a pretty good indication of where things are headed. So if you can imagine a piece of paper, and you put a dot in the middle of it, and I ask you where the next dot's going to be. Well, it could be anywhere, 360 degrees. But if I can show you all the dots preceding that dot, and then I ask you where the next dot's going to be, you could say, well, you know what? You can put a ruler up next to it and sort of plot it, and the next dot might be up here somewhere, right? And so knowing history gives us an indicator of how things are going. So one of the things I've did is researched every single century of human history, and to find out what the form of government is. And believe it or not, it's kings. So from Nimrod Tower of Babel to 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs and Assyrian kings, Babylonian kings, Persian kings, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Indian Maharajas, 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. It's kings. Until finally the King of England had the most powerful empire on the planet. And the only thing different is military advancements allow the kings to kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they're killing with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear or scimitar sword or gunpowder. The weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. It's just magnified through technology. So St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And technological advancements allows the king to track more people. Right? And so you had Augustus Caesar wanting to have a worldwide tracking system. He called it a census. If he could have had 5G and cell phones to track everybody, he would have done it that way, right? And so the King of England ended up becoming the most powerful king on the planet. 13 million square miles, 500 million people. All of India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, right, and America. So the King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. And America's founders didn't like that. And we broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. And so, but the other side didn't stop. And they're still trying, right, to get control of the world. And if any one of these dictators had not died, any one of them would have been happy to be the Antichrist. Any one of them would have been happy. Right? I mean, Attila the Hun had an army of 500,000 people. He's wiping out city after city after city in Europe. And a woman named Genevieve got all of Paris to fast and pray, and Attila skipped sacking Paris. But if he didn't die, he'd have been glad to keep conquering. Genghis Khan killed 30 million people from Korea to Hungary in the 1200s. If he hadn't have died, he'd have been happy to keep killing. Right? So in a sense, death is a blessing because the devil has to start from scratch, right, with the next generation to raise up a dictator. But there's clearly a global goal in mind. And now with the technology that we have, that it looks like we're getting pretty close. Anyway, so with that, I have a presentation on a book called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. And I've got several parts to this presentation, but I'm going to start off with this. So Plato, why do we start with him? He's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds good until you think it through. Somebody has to be in the government that distributes all this owned in common stuff. And they like their job. And they're going to be tempted to want to give a little extra to their family and friends on the side. And they're going to be tempted to hold back from somebody they just don't like. And before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. And so every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy controlling everything with the most corrupt politician at the top of it who's a dictator. Right? So again, every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a dictatorship. And so Plato, he's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island. It's got, you know, all these rings and boats, and it's all really super organized, and it sinks in the sea. And he refers to it having existed at least 800 years before he lived. And so here, this would have been way back, probably around the time Moses coming out of Egypt. But whether Atlantis existed or not, Plato thought that it did. There is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini, which is what's left of a volcano. And now it's a really nice tourist place with a little Greek village built along the cliff. I went there in college. It's really beautiful. But when it blew up, it would have wiped out lots of civilizations throughout the Mediterranean. So Plato considered Atlantis the ideal structured society. Everybody say structured. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Everybody say unstructured. So democracy, demos means people, cracy means rule. So in a democracy, the people rule. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And he says the state is like a bazaar where you can buy anything. It's like a piece of embroidery with the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government full of variety and disorder. And then this disorder begins to creep into their manner of life. He goes, the manner of life is that of Democrats. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. And of course, he's using that term because he's referring to a democracy. And it says the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear him, and the son having no fear or shame of his parents. So now they're tolerating disrespect in the home. And then they tolerate disrespect in the classroom. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors. And then they tolerate financial irresponsibility. It's a democracy, so they vote to take the money from the city treasury and spread it around. Now the treasury is empty. And then they vote to take the money from the rich people. He says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And then it gets into their morality. And he says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. He has parted company with all shame. Yes, that's what he's talking about, right? Matter of fact, a study was done by an Oxford anthropologist named J.D. Unwin, and he wrote a book in 1934 called Sex and Culture, and he observed 80 civilizations, including Athens, that existed over a 5,000-year period of time, sort of like what I did. But he saw that the loosening of sexual restraints always leads to civilizational decline, that promiscuity always precedes the collapse of a civilization. And he says that civilizations go through 4 stages. The first is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, they make it through, they work hard. It's great. And then they pitch in and they work together, and they become productive and patriotic and protective. And then finally, they achieve their prosperity. They finally get to where they wanted. And then they get a little pleasure focused, and they want to enjoy their prosperity. And they get a little promiscuous and indulgent and undisciplined, lazy and weakened, and they get conquered by the next rising civilization. And he said, after observing 80 major civilizations over 5,000 years, he says that it's irreversible. Once a society starts going down this promiscuous side, there's no stopping. It's like a snowball effect, because human nature wants the pleasure. And he even called it a sexual marketplace. He says when women as a whole say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys say, well, whatever it takes, they make the commitment, and then they go out and be productive for their wife. And then the next thing is little kids appear, and the guy has a new emotion of being protective and productive. And when all the men of the country are protective and productive, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive and protective and expansionistic and innovative and creative and even militaristic. But when the women say there does not need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level. And you'll have a bunch of guys saying, hey, pleasure time. And they get more selfish focused. And there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. And when enough of the men of the country act this way, the whole country gets weakened. And they get conquered by the next rising civilization. And anyway, so John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry S. Truman worded it this way, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So we're going to go ahead and have the freedom, but if there's no internal morals and virtue, it's just going to turn into chaos. So Plato said Athens, they tolerate each other, it's great. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating lawlessness, random violence, insecurity, people being robbed, buildings being set on fire, and the people begin to panic, and they'll be willing to trade their freedom for security. And so they look for someone to come along and fix this unstructured mess. And along comes a governor and says, I can fix it, I just need some emergency powers. Just temporarily, right? Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. He's such a nice guy. I met him. He gives these nice speeches. But then he begins to consolidate power. And people are now beginning to say, oh, he's getting too powerful. And if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he will have a good pretext for destroying them. And then Plato says, how does this protector change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. So tyrants have two tools in their toolbox, fraud and force. Fraud is they'll lie to you as long as you'll let them, but when people begin to see through the lies, their popularity poll begins to decline. And once people see through the charades that this person is really a bad person, they can't fool them anymore. The next tool in their toolbox is force. And so that's when they purge their military of anybody with virtue. So all they have left is yes men. And then they use the military to enforce their tyranny. And he says, standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. And having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. So he sends the mob out to destroy his political opponents. And now Plato said that democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue. And he says people really don't have virtue. If you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel's attempt to rule without a king lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so Plato says, this virtue thing, it's not going to last. And Plato says if someone was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. He writes this, 380 BC, if a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. Could you imagine he writes this 380 years before Christ? Well, Plato concluded that the best, since democracy is doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. Now, let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, maybe there would be a nice tyrant, but he doesn't live forever, and at some point he's got to hand all this power onto a kid or a grandkid who's a lousy ruler but likes his job and becomes oppressive. What's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt is a godly man, and he concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. But what did that Pharaoh do with the concentrated power? Well, he fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land of Goshen, gave them jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, make them slaves, and even throw their sons in the Nile River. So that's the dilemma. Even if you do get a good king, and he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently, he's going to pass it on to somebody else that's not a good king and is going to use that power. That's the dilemma politically. We get our guy in there, and we sort of say, well, it's okay that he, consolidates power and maybe sidesteps the Constitution in certain areas because he wants to do something good. Okay, well, even if he wants to do something good, at some point, he's not going to have that power anymore, and it's going to go to the other party. And they're going to use it for bad. And so Plato concluded that the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. He's the head of gold, and his administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver. Together they make up the ruling class. And they get special benefits, and it's okay for them to get special benefits because the alternative is democracy, which ends in chaos, so they get to be treated extra special. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They're the peasants. They're the worker class. They just got to do what they're told. They're ruled. So socialism, going back to Plato, is a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners. They can do special things, like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. Remember Nancy Pelosi there in California? And they decide who gets what. Now, the ruled class, yes, everyone is provided for, but nobody owns anything. It's the ruling class that decides who gets what. They're the deep state. And so the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. And there are no families in Plato's perfect society. The government decides who gets to have children. And then the government takes the children away from the parents. And the children are brought into the city, into the government schools, and they're indoctrinated to serve the ruling class. Plato says that when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And these children will be taught lies, noble lies. Plato said, we want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. But it's okay to teach these kids lies because the lies help the tyrant king stay in power, and since democracy is doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant king, right? And so every attempt at socialism always ends up with the government wanting to take the kids away from the parents and brainwash them. Now, Plato's perfect society on the island of Atlantis inspired Sir Thomas More's island of Utopia in 1516. The word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci shortly after Columbus. And it's written as a Greek dialogue. If you've ever read Plato, it's a discussion between Socrates and somebody else and sort of goes back and forth. Well, this is written that way, and the discussion is with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. And so you have this island of nowhere told to us by the peddler of nonsense. And on this utopia island, it's perfectly structured. There's an upper class rulers, deep state, the lower class commoners. There's free health care. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. Free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in free identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse, and the deep state decides who gets what. There are no taverns, no ale houses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy on Utopia. Everyone is tracked everywhere they go with an internal passport. If you're caught without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. This is 1516. They're talking about tracking everyone. The government decides everyone's careers on Utopia. And there are no families, just like Plato. Childbearing is regulated by the government, very similar to China's one-child policy or Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood. No woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So, Plato's structured society on the island of Atlantis inspired Sir Thomas More's island of Utopia in 1516. By the way, Sir Thomas More wrote this as a veiled criticism of Henry VIII. He's the one who switched from Catholic to Protestant, and anybody that didn't follow him immediately, he killed, and so he killed Sir Thomas More. Well, that all inspired Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote New Atlantis. He calls his work New Atlantis because he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And again, this is a fictitious island in the South Pacific, highly structured, ruling class, ruled class. There's a more scientific careers, but the government dictates everything about everybody's lives. Somebody wrote a satire on this, and you've read it. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Here's Gulliver washed up on an island of Lilliput and finds out everything is structured with this ruling class that controls everybody's life, and then the ruled class that just has to work their jobs. Why is this important? The Pilgrims. It's around this time that the Pilgrims come to America. The Pilgrims had no money, so they went to investors in England who wrote up bylaws for a company. And in the Pilgrim bylaws, they modeled after Plato and Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon, and it says that everything would be owned in common. It says all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain still in ye common stock, and all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel and provision out of ye common stock. And it sounded nice, right? Everybody owns everything together, but the Pilgrims almost starved to death trying it. Nobody wanted to work. He says the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. I just think this is so interesting that the Pilgrim governor, William Bradford, actually lists, he says, the emptiness of the theory of Plato. In other words, they knew that they were trying to live out this theoretical owning everything in common, right? So Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon, these are just a bunch of guys around a table coming up with these ideas. Hey, I got an idea. Let's let everybody own everything. The Pilgrims were the first ones that actually tried to live it out. William Bradford says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger ones thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it. You're not going to wash that guy's clothes. And Bradford goes on, let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want. After much debate, the governor, with a chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. You plant corn for your household. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So here the Pilgrims themselves tried to have everybody own everything in common. It didn't work. They scrapped it, and they gave everyone their own plot of land. So people ask the question, wasn't the early church socialist? No, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the differences between the word voluntary and involuntary, and church and government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their lands, and they laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. They didn't have their land taken away, and then they were involuntarily forced to lay the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. Here, government, here's a little more money, right? Whenever the government does anything, it's in exchange for your freedoms. Now, in the Bible, every family was given property when they went into the promised land. They actually call it promised land because the people got land. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of your stuff. The Bible called that charity. Right? So you get stuff, it's blessings from God, and you're put in this position where you have the opportunity to voluntarily give away some of your stuff to help other people. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase from capitalism to communism. And Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. Well, if you do not own property, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody? Now you're a thief, you've broken the law? No, God entrusts you with stuff, and you have the opportunity to manifest in this physical world the generosity and love that God put in your heart. But it's voluntary. And now, didn't Jesus teach socialism? Well, let's look at one of his parables. It's called the parable of the talents or the minas. Gives one guy 5, multiplies it to 10. Another guy 2, multiplies it to 4, and then the one guy buried it. He says, "Sir, here's your mina. I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth." His master replied, "You wicked servant." He said to those standing by, "Take his mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas." They said, "Sir, he already has 10. He replied, "I tell you that everyone who has more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away." In other words, the hand of the diligent shall bear rule. Give it to the guy that's going to do something with it. The lazy guy that buries it is going to lose. If Jesus were a socialist, he would have said, "Okay, that guy that got 10, divide it up equally amongst everybody else." No. He didn't divide it up equally. He took from the lazy guy and gave it to the guy that's going to do something with it. He'll multiply it again. So there's a confusion as to the roles of government in the Bible. So in the Bible, God clearly gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for the individuals to take care of poor, right? Clothe them and feed them and so forth. The commands to the family are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. The business commands are mostly do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. The church is definitely commanded to take care of the poor, and historically they did. And they immediately started feeding the orphans and the widows, and over time started hospitals and medical clinics and orphanages and took care of maimed soldiers and shut-ins. Did you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And James Madison, who was the 4th president and also considered the architect of the Constitution, he said, "Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government." And Representative Davy Crockett, there was a fire in Georgetown, and a bunch of people who were very patriotic had their houses burned. And so Congress was going to vote to take federal money and give it to them. And Davy Crockett said no. He says, "Congress has not the power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate a dollar of the public money as charity." Right? You can't give away something that belongs to somebody else, right? That's thievery, right? You don't. Calvin Coolidge says, "It does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it." We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. It's the individual's job. It's the church's job. We need to feed the sick. We need to take care of the immigrants. We need to do all that stuff, but it's not the government's job, right? So after the Second Great Awakening revival in America, with Charles Finney saying that you have to do something to show your Christian faith, right? You're saved by faith, but you don't just go there and hear sermons all day long. You got to do something. And so his preaching inspired George Williams to start the YMCA. And his lectures on revival influenced William and Catherine Booth to start the Salvation Army. And his preaching helped start the abolitionist movement, and started Bible societies, and there were movements to pass out Bibles to every house in New Jersey, and they had all these different eventually temperance societies and suffrage societies. But it was individual people getting an idea on how to meet needs, and they would just go out there and do it, and people would give to them. Clara Barton starting the American Red Cross, You began to see in the early 1900s the government encouraging people to donate to the Red Cross. But it wasn't the government giving federal money, it was just encouraging you to donate. So the idea, again, Calvin Coolidge, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. Gerald Ford put it this way. People say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look at them in the eye and say, Do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? And so, here's a thought. What if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish sees that shiny thing and they're caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare. Free is attractive. But there's a hook there. You give up your independence. You give up control of your life. Now, when the church helps someone, it's called disinterested benevolence. You're helping them for no other reason than to help them, and you don't want anything in return, and hopefully someday they'll get better off and they'll help the next needy person that comes along. And this thing called the body of Christ can grow. Whenever the government helps anybody, it's always in exchange for something. If you're in Egypt, you need food. The government's happy to help you, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives. When the church helps people, the person that's giving feels the joy of the Lord of God using them to meet someone's need. And the recipient experiences the love of God through a real person, right? And they're grateful to God for it. Whenever the government helps anybody, it is always impersonal. You don't know whose pocket that money came out of that turned into your welfare check. And the person, instead of being grateful, begins to view it as a debt that is owed to them, and they get upset if it's delayed. And then there's another dynamic. The recipient begins to lose self-esteem. And they want to channel that negative feeling. They want to blame somebody. And they end up blaming the very government giving them the free stuff. They end up hating the very government giving them free stuff. It's a very strange dynamic, but it's real. So the Pilgrims, they switched from company to covenant. They switched from bylaws where everything is involuntarily taken away from them. They don't have a choice about it. And to a covenant form of government where they get the stuff and they get the opportunity to voluntarily give away some of their stuff. Voluntary versus involuntary is sort of a big deal with God. It's sort of like the whole reason He made us. Everything else follows rules, laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, and all the other animals He created follow instinct. Right? They migrate. They do all that stuff. Humans have this thing called free will, right? So we're different. And we get this opportunity to freely let the love of God go through us. So the Pilgrims, they switched from company to covenant. Covenant is a form of government they got from ancient Israel. And it's where you get rights and blessings from God. And you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're accountable to God. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. And so this was studied a lot from the Reformation 1517 to the early 1600s, the Age of Enlightenment. You had a century where the scholars in Europe were studying not just the Bible in their own language. They were studying that first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt before they got King Saul. It was called the Hebrew Republic. And again, it's the first instance in recorded human history of a nation with millions of people and no king. And you don't really realize how unique it is until you read all the other civilizations and kingdoms and empires that were on the earth at the time when Israel came out of Egypt. Right? You had eventually 5,000 years of Chinese emperors and Indian Maharajas and Germanic chieftains and tribal chieftains and African chieftains, and then you had, King Og of Bashan and all these different, the whole world was kings. And here you have Israel comes out of Egypt, and for 400 years, no king. This Hebrew Republic was studied so much so that they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And Yale, this is the Yale coat of arms, they have Hebrew characters on it to this day. And it means light and truth, and actually Urim and Thummim. Right, but it stands for light and truth. And so let's look for a moment at Israel, their covenant form of government, where they had no king for 400 years, And this was studied by Yale and the different founders of the different colonies in America. So that first 400-year period before King Saul, everyone was equal. You see, wherever there's a king, if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. In Israel, there was no king, and the law specifically said there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone is to be treated the same. Male and female, made in the image of the Creator. Israel is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. And Israel had tolerance. Here they were worshiping the one true God, and they never felt compelled to go out and force people to worship the one true God. Right? If you wanted to be a proselyte, and but they didn't say, well, get your lamb and drag it to the temple. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. If you own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed, and you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of your stuff. The Bible called that charity. Ancient Israel had no police. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. It was like everybody was deputized. We have a little of that where maybe a mom's watching a bunch of neighborhood kids. She has no problem correcting somebody else's kid. In ancient Israel, everybody corrected everybody else. Right? It was a self-policing system. In Israel, the children were taught the law. Remember how Plato wanted to take the kids away from the parents and indoctrinate them with noble lies? The kids is the prize. You're a spirit, mind, and body. Your mind is like a super fancy computer, and your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. Imagine if I were to say blue computers are better than red computers. You're like, duh, it really doesn't matter what color the computer is. What matters is what software is running on it. Doesn't matter what color your iPhone is. It's what apps are on it. Doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is what behavioral software is running in their brain. Is it the gospel? Love your enemies. Do good to those that hate you. Turn the other cheek. Bless those that curse you. Walk the extra mile, right? Or is it selfish, default, virus, corrupted files of being mean to people and so forth? So the battle is who gets to load the software on the next generation's brains. And God chose Abraham because he knew he would train his children after him. And then ancient Israel had no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. But in ancient Israel, every man was in the militia and armed with a sword upon their thigh and ready at a moment's notice to defend their family and their community. Israel had no prisons. Remember in Egypt, Joseph was in prison for several years? In Israel, when a crime was committed, you got the accused and the elders, and you had the trial right then at the city gates. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. What's that? Remember in Egypt, people would trade their souls for a bag of grain? While in Israel, when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings, the corners, for the poor people to pick through, like Ruth. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out in exchange for, favors. And Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures. Became the basis for commerce. And Israel got to choose their own leaders of their different tribes and villages. Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I alone bear your burden? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. So this was a election process within the tribe. You know the people that hate covetousness and they just can't be bribed, right? And so anyone in ancient Israel could be raised up into leadership. So here is Gideon, a nobody. Here's Deborah, a woman. She becomes a national leader in Israel. Not because she's related to royalty. It's just her. She knows the law. She's honest. The reputation spread. She sits under a tree. People make their way all the way across the country for her to hear their case and tell what the law says. Where else in the world could a woman become a national leader that's not related to royalty? So Harvard President Samuel Langdon gave an address in 1788. He says, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages of government on republican principles. From abject slavery, a mere mob, to a well-regulated nation under laws far superior to what any other nation could boast. Think of it. They go from 400 years of slavery. They can't even read. And suddenly, they get downloaded the most unique form of government that the world has ever seen. So contrary to all these kings and pharaohs and sultans, right? It had to be God. And then Israel was the first nation that could read. So in Sumeria, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters. But it was only for kings and scribes. Egypt had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters, but only for the pharaohs and the scribes. It was only 1% of Egypt could read. Reading and writing was the scribes' secret knowledge. They actually kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. And China had 10,000 characters, only for court records. Only the upper class could read. We had a little of that in America prior to the Civil War, where some of the southern states actually made it a crime to teach slaves to read. Frederick Douglass grew up on a plantation, and the master sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet, and her husband walks in, yells at her, and says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read, it's illegal." Frederick Douglass says that was the first sermon that convinced him that he wanted to learn how to read. Anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss said, ancient writing's main function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. Again, it was this deep state, and they knew what was going on, and everybody else was kept in the dark. So when Moses comes down the mountain, he doesn't just have the law. He has the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter Beth. Sound familiar? It's so easy to learn, kids could learn it. So the priests not only taught the law, they taught everyone how to read the law for themselves. Israel was the first literate population on planet Earth. Here's a quote from Eupolemus, 158 BC. Moses was the first wise man that taught the alphabet to the Jews, who passed it to the Phoenicians, who passed it to the Greeks. And so if you think of governments as a line, with one side being total government and the other side being no government. Total government, you get kings who rule through fear. It's like the Lord of the Rings, right? Power wants to concentrate into the hands of one, they rule through fear. The other side is no government. Well, no government would be anarchy unless everyone is taught the law. It's like everybody downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS telling you where to turn, imagine a behavioral app that tells you how to act in real time, right? Don't steal that, don't lose your temper. And the Levites were the computer geeks that help you to download the app, right? But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There is a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair. He's going to hold you accountable in the future. You're about to steal. Nobody's around. You know you can get away with it. And then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And so it creates something in your head called the conscience. And so if everybody in the country believes this, you can maintain complete order and safety with no police, right? Now, it's interesting. The Bible says that Lucifer said, I will be like the Most High God. Remember that? Get cast out of heaven. And so if everybody is being aware that they're being watched, the devil wants to replace that with cameras and tracking devices and 5G. And so in China, right, they have millions of cameras. They have apps that track, and so they have a social credit score. And so everybody modifies their behavior because the government is watching them. The government wants to take the place of God. It wants to make everybody every day think, I'm being watched by the government, right? Whereas in ancient Israel, every day they said, God's watching me. I want to be good to everybody because God's watching me. Right? So it's sort of interesting how that dynamic works. Now, God knew that the Israelites would sin, and rather than them walk around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, where everybody's sins for the whole country were forgiven for the past year, and you get to start off the new year with a clean slate. And this is foreshadowing Jesus. And anyway, so I have more there, but is this session out of time? All right. Well, I think I'm going to be back for another session and maybe more. So Did you get anything out of this? Was this interesting? All right.
He already got the applause, but I want to give him a round of applause again. Let's do that and thank Bill Federer for that excellent presentation. Now, we're going to take a break in just a moment, but first I want to tell you about some of the excellent resources we have from Bill Federer. Of course, the presentation you've been listening to is dealing with Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. That book is available back on the table. And to our folks that are watching on YouTube, which this is now being shared on a couple different Facebook pages, as well as the SWRC page and your church's page as well, YouTube page. So we've got a lot of people that are watching on YouTube. You can get these resources at our website, SWRC.com. That's SWRC.com. Now, folks that are here at the conference, you don't got to pay shipping. You can go get it right now. Back here at the back table, we've got this book. Another really neat book that Bill Federer has is Rise of the Tyrant. This is really a neat book, The 6,000-Year Quest for Global Power. And also this book, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century. I remember him coming on the Watchman on the Wall program, on our radio program, to talk about this book recently. It's How the Pilgrims Escaped It, the prequel to America's Freedom. That's also available on the back table. There's DVDs of various, of some of the books and some different presentations that are also available at the resource table. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and this is for those that are here at the conference, not those watching online, but the presentation that you've been watching on the PowerPoint, this session and the one that Bill Federer will give later this evening is all available on a flash drive. So it is available on a flash drive for $20. It's there on the back at the resource table where Mr. Federer is waving, sort of in his mind, and his son there. But that is a really neat resource that they've prepared for us, for people like me that can't write real fast when they're taking the notes. So I thought that was a really neat resource to have as well, and so that's available. So we want to encourage you to check out the different books and DVDs and USB flash drive type resources from Bill Federer, as well as all of the other books and DVDs we have as well. We're going to come back at 1:20. We've got a really special treat. Pastor Larry is going to have a special message for us, and so those that go to church here, you still have to come to church on Sunday. This doesn't count as your message for Sunday morning, okay? He told me, no, he didn't tell me to say that. I'm just kidding. All right, so let's take a little bathroom break, go get some resources from the table. We'll be back here at 1:20 with Pastor Larry. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone, including Marvin, who I know is watching online. He told me he was watching online in his office, so he's not actually getting any work done right now. He's watching the conference, and I'm glad he is. I'm glad everyone is. Thank you all for being here.